Ladies and gentlemen, happy Wednesday night. I'm Jeremy Birmingham. That's Andrew Ellis, and this is Talking Stuff, the Ohio State Recruiting Podcast, brought to you by The Podcast. Andrew, you are going to Cedar Point on Friday. I just had a weekend off, which is very rare, but appreciated. And so we didn't get a chance to really catch up after some of last week's shenanigans. We did have the Justin Scott, commitment analysis when that happened. And I think the funniest thing about that is that we went into last weekend preparing for a Chicago defensive lineman to commit and made a commitment analysis video for Marquise Lightfoot, who ended up changing his mind the day of his decision and committed to Miami. And before we really start diving into what this episode is going to be about, which is breaking down the next month and what I think are the 10 players who can commit inside the next month for to Ohio State or other schools. So, but Lightfoot is one that I think we should just touch on because it does feel like it's a reminder of how different recruiting is now than it was even 3 years ago, because this is not a recruiting battle that Ohio State would have lost 3 years ago, but it's also one that in the big picture of things doesn't feel entirely like a loss, because in many ways, Ohio State just said, if you want to go to Miami, go ahead, because they have to focus their priorities. And when I say priorities, I mean some NIL responsibilities on other players. And it's like, are we dealing with a salary cap in college football now? Because that's kind of how it feels.
No, it does feel that way. I think, the kid took his official visit to Ohio State in June. Everything was positive coming out of that visit. All the future casts and crystal balls and all that stuff were on Ohio State. All of a sudden, he took a couple other visits. I don't think we were really ever thinking USC was in it all that much. And then, of course, he took that visit to Miami. Even coming out of that visit, there were still positive vibes. And then heading into that weekend prior to the announcement, prior to the 4th of July holiday, I think there were starting to be a little bit of drum beats that maybe Miami's in this more than we previously had thought. But I mean, it's a loss for Ohio State because it's absolutely a guy that they wanted. But like you said, this is a guy that 5 years ago or even a couple years ago, I feel like they would get. And, it's a Chicago kid, so maybe something changes between now and the early signing period. But, kind of an interesting recruitment.
Yeah, and it's going to feel like a situation where people will look back on it and say, oh, I thought Ohio State had NIL figured out. Oh, I thought, how are they still losing these battles when it comes to NIL? But it's not about that. It's about Ohio State sets their own valuations for each player. And if another school is willing to go way above and beyond what Ohio State has a player valued at, then Ohio State will, in some cases, say, okay, well, this is your choice. Feel free to make it. And I think it will lead to some frustration for folks who are going to be wanting Ohio State to be constantly all in, all in, all in. But when you're making plays around the country, and we'll get into some of those guys that are going to be talked about in this episode, but you have to prioritize things, and you have to shift you have to reallocate resources in a way to make sure that you're getting what you really need. And then as October, November, December comes around, then you can come back to what you want. And I think that this is a case where Larry Johnson's recruiting efforts are not going to slow down with Marquise Lightfoot, but they're also going to be somewhat relying on the fact that Miami should be average as a football team, and that as we get closer to the actual signing period in December, that a player from Chicago may get cold feet, literally and figuratively, about leaving home and going that far away. So I don't think it's over for Ohio State and Marquise Lightfoot, but it was certainly a surprise. And it's a commitment that felt like it was all Ohio State. And I mentioned it 3 weeks ago on one of our episodes of Talking Stuff that there's a list of players who have told the Ohio State staff that they are in, right? And Marquise Lightfoot was certainly one of those guys. And the question is now, in the world of NIL, because it's not like an NFL contract. And I know that people believe that we're moving toward an NFL model in college football and recruiting. But the difference is when you agree to something in these terms and you don't sign something, then every day is a renegotiation. And it becomes really difficult for coaching staffs around the country to feel comfortable or settled in something that someone said 3 weeks ago, because literally every single conversation with another school is now changing that agreement in some way, or forcing that player to adjust what they're asking for, or what their players are, or what their third uncle is telling them that they're worth, or whatever. And it's very strange to have these conversations about college football, but like it just doesn't feel settled. And no matter how many guys say that they're in or out, and because NIL changes the conversation every day. And that's where we're going to start this episode with Jaden Jackson, who makes his college football future announcement on Thursday, July 13th. I wrote about it at OhioState.Rivals.com on Tuesday. My belief is that he's going to end up somewhere not Ohio State. At this point, I'm actually leaning toward Oklahoma for Jaden Jackson, as Texas and Miami have been the teams involved. But this is another recruitment where it felt like a month ago there was no way this ends a different way. But again, when players are being told one thing, or being given an idea of their potential NIL value that doesn't match up with what Ohio State is thinking, at least as far as these early agreements go, these agreements that are what happens when you get on campus type of deals, then all of a sudden you can't blame a kid for going elsewhere, even if he's a Midwest guy, even if he loves Larry Johnson, even if the Buckeyes have a position of need like defensive tackle, et cetera. And I think it's going to be Oklahoma for Jaden Jackson tomorrow.
Yeah, I think through most of June, I was kind of under the impression that Ohio State was in the driver's seat and he was likely to end up, back in the Midwest for college. And then I think it was interesting because then he visited Texas and there was all this Texas buzz coming out of that. And now, like you said, it seems like those two schools that seem like the top contenders, it doesn't seem like he's going to end up at either one of those. And maybe he does pick Texas, who knows? But I think, and we've talked a lot on the pod about there not being a lot of names out there for the interior part of the defensive line. And you said it, earlier this week, just the fact that Justin Scott committed, the fact that they added Tywone Malone, they took a pretty big defensive tackle class in 2023. So, I mean, maybe they're just content with Justin Scott, and that's going to be the guy on the interior part of the line for 2024. That seems like a distinct possibility right now. I know Eddrick Houston's a guy they can kind of move around, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, and I think that you actually have to look at this from a different perspective. And again, Jaden Jackson is a guy who on Thursday morning is going to have conversations with all of these schools that are recruiting him. And it's almost like these conversations become last and best type of deals in the real estate business. Like, this is our last and final offer. This is the best we can do. And then you have to decide then. So I think you're going to see a lot of the old rules are just gone, and people will make a lot of decisions at the last moment as teams that are potentially more desperate are willing to pay a little bit more or promise a little bit more in the NIL world. And that's where, like, it's harder than ever to gauge exactly where a recruitment is going, because these unknown factors, and I say unknown in the fact that kids are not openly talking about this stuff and how much money they're being offered, or how much, promises are being made, or who's keeping what, who's the one doing the negotiations in their family, et cetera. Like, a lot of times they don't even know. So it's just a weird vibe all around. But I agree with you that the decision to add Tywone Malone after signing 3 defensive tackles in the class of 2023 does open the door for only Justin Scott in this class at defensive tackle. Again, you get the nation's best defensive tackle, so that changes a little bit of the need and drops the onus a little bit. You are expecting him to contribute early, and you at that point don't need to stack on top of it. But you also have Tywone Malone at least for one more year after this one. You have Hero Kanu. You still have Ty Hamilton for potentially 2 more years. Like, it's not a situation that's dire like the defensive end position. I thought Ohio State would sign 2 defensive tackles because I didn't really think that there was a real shot at Justin Scott. And I think if you don't get the best at that position, then you have to mitigate the talent disparity by adding more guys. But now it's a better play for Scott to say, hey, you're our only guy. You're the only tackle we're taking. It's a harder sell for everyone else who are saying, hey, I don't want to compete against this guy, or I don't want to be in the same class as him after they sign 3. So all in all, I think it does shape out for Ohio State to only sign 1 And then if they do need someone to be supplemented, the transfer portal, which I really do think Ohio State is going to be much more aggressive in November and December in the transfer portal this upcoming year than they were last year. So then it becomes like you can go there and find it. And you're getting guys like Tywone Malone who have a very good first year of college football under him in the weight room. And like, he's much more physically ready than a high school defensive tackle anyway. So it feels like a win-win.
Yeah, it does. And I guess just putting a bow on the Jaden Jackson thing, like it feels like one of those recruitments that we don't see many of these days, to where it's like commitment eve and we still really don't have a strong vibe where it's going to be. I guess the strongest thing we do feel is just that it's not going to be Ohio State tomorrow for him. And, you know, maybe they just end up with the number one defensive tackle in the country. And if that's the case, then, you know, that's a pretty good class, even if it's just one guy.
Yeah. Again, my vibe right now is that it's going to be Oklahoma. But much like it was with Marquise Lightfoot, I wouldn't be surprised if Miami makes a play last minute. I wouldn't be surprised if Jaden Jackson follows his heart and says, hey, actually, I want to be at Ohio State or Texas, and decides to go that way. But I am saying quite clearly, like, it is harder and harder to read these recruitments than ever before. And so you're relying very much on what people inside of programs or coaches or around the country are saying. And right now, I think it's going to be Oklahoma. So in this episode, we're just going to go in order here of the players that are committing over the next month that have commitment dates publicized. And then at the end, we'll talk about a few guys that are expected to commit in the next month but don't have a specific date planned. So we're moving on from Jaden Jackson to Edwin Spillman, a player that does not get talked about nearly enough for Ohio State, despite the fact that he's one of the earliest offers in the class, despite the fact that he's been to campus 4 or 5 times. Great relationship with James Laurinaitis, loves Jim Knowles, but his brother's at Tennessee. He's committing on July 21st. There's been no answer yet. I feel confident in saying that from people I've talked to around the Ohio State program. He has not given them a definitive, I'm going to Tennessee. And I say that only because I think it's important, because people will assume that this is a done deal. His brother's at Tennessee as a freshman wide receiver. His family lives basically, 30 minutes away from Knoxville. It feels like that's going to end up at Tennessee, but Ohio State would absolutely take 4 linebackers in this class if they can. If the next 2 were Edwin Spillman and Kyngstonn Viliamu-Asa. So is it worth even thinking about this recruitment as he gets ready to decide in the next Nendice? It is. It is worth it. It is.
Yeah, I mean, it's worth thinking about it, but I've admittedly just kind of put this one on the back burner just because I've just long assumed it's going to be Tennessee for all those reasons you mentioned earlier. We talked about him being a very early offer. Like you said, Kyngstonn, Ohio State was his first offer. So, I mean, I don't know. If you get one of those 2 guys, great. But my assumption is that it's not going to be Spillman. But, stranger things have happened.
Yeah, and they're very similar players, and that sort of plays into this as well. They're both true Mike linebacker prospects. Viliamu-Asa is a touch bigger, but they both are inside guys and players that Ohio State really likes, people that Ohio State really likes. So, we can move kind of quickly through these 2 because Viliamu-Asa makes his decision 3 days after Edwin Spillman, and he'll make his on July 24th. So, like right now, I believe firmly that Ohio State is in the catbird seat when it comes to Viliamu-Asa. But if something happened on July 21st and Edwin Spillman shocked the world and picked Ohio State, then all of a sudden you could see things get a little bit weird in the recruitment of Kyngstonn Viliamu-Asa from St. John Bosco in California, and Notre Dame or USC then could end up being the pick. Not that they couldn't still be the pick now, but for a kid that doesn't say much about his recruitment, and he's not really a game player, the fact, and while I would always caution people to not be too concerned with what people are wearing when they're at a tournament or a 7-on-7 or what they post on social media, Viliamu-Asa has been seen at the last 3 weeks since his Ohio State official visit wearing only Ohio State stuff at events out west. He's also deleted every photo on his Instagram other than Ohio State stuff. So like you can, it doesn't mean everything, but it doesn't mean nothing when it comes to a player like, and a person like him who is not by any means the traditional game player or a guy that loves the recruiting drama. So I'm not saying that's a done deal, but it feels like it's really trending in Ohio State direction. And Andrew, you've seen it reading around the Notre Dame side, like they've seemed to be conceding just a touch on that in the last couple of days.
I mean, there was some of that on the Notre Dame side, and then there was like this renewed communication between him and the Notre Dame staff, and a little bit of optimism. I don't know. Like I thought for the longest time it was probably going to be Ohio State versus USC. It seems to me like Ohio State's probably the favorite right now. I don't think I'd put like all my chips in or anything like that on that one, but he seems like an Ohio State type of kid, and it seems like a battle that James Laurinaitis is going to win, quite frankly.
Yeah, and the reality is when you're dealing with a player like this, I don't know that it matters. I mean, I'm going to say this. Obviously, Ohio State fans, you're going to want him to commit to Ohio State. He was the first player they offered in the class of 2024. But this recruitment will be decided in November, and it's always going to be go away from home or stay at home, and whatever team is the go away from home option, whether that becomes Ohio State or Notre Dame on the 24th of July, which I think he will. I think if I had to handicap this race, like it's Ohio State, then Notre Dame, then USC right now. But come November, if USC is playing great football and they're showing an improved defense and they're doing a lot of the things that people out west are waiting to see from Lincoln Riley's program, and then all of a sudden you flip Peyton Woodyard from Georgia, I think that makes this a much more challenging keep for Ohio State 5 months from now than it does being like getting the commitment in 10 days. You know what I mean? So that's where I think this one gets a little bit funky. But the reality is Ohio State is in a great spot with Kyngstonn Viliamu-Asa. And if we're playing in or out of the guys that we've dealt with so far, he's the first in for me on this episode of Talking Stuff presented by the podcast. Are you are generally more pessimistic than I am when it comes to this stuff, which is crazy because, again, everyone thinks I'm the pessimist in the Ohio State recruiting world, which I don't know how that's the case, but I guess it is. But Viliamu-Asa, even you feel like you're leaning positive on that one, which is good to see because I worry about your long-term health.
Yeah, your pessimism mostly involves Cincinnati sports, which I kind of get.
Professional sports, yes.
Professional sports, yes. No, I feel pretty good about this one. I don't feel like it's a grand slam dunk at this point. We still got some time to play out. And it could get interesting during the season, depending on what happens with his teammate and Alex Grinch's defense. But I feel pretty good about this one heading into the commitment. So I'm with you.
So that's July 24th. If we're handicapping at home, like what I think the next Ohio State commitment will be in the class of 2024, the 24th is where I would put most of my chips at the moment. And then after that, 6 days later comes Aaron Scott's decision, and he'll commit on his father's birthday, deciding between Ohio State and Michigan. If he's in Ann Arbor that day for the Michigan barbecue at the Big House, I think it's a pretty safe bet that it means he's committing to the Wolverines. If he's not, then I think that it is a positive for Ohio State. Speaking of not make a big deal about what kids are wearing at certain events, Aaron Scott was at a 7-on-7 workout on Tuesday wearing maize and blue Jordan cleats, gloves. Now, I want to be clear about something. We all know those are Michigan cleats, okay? But they don't have to be. And for the kids' team, high school team that is blue and yellow, and a high school soon-to-be senior cornerback, like, you just want to look as cool as possible, right? And, like, if he showed up wearing Ohio State stuff on Tuesday with his blue and gold Springfield attire, he'd look tacky as hell. It wouldn't look good. And then people would just assume he's going to Ohio State, which is definitely not the case. It's not true that he's made a decision at this point. So either way, it was going to be like kind of weird. But the way I look at it is, if you've got these really awesome $200 pair of Jordan cleats that I'm sure you were definitely not just handed at the University of Michigan, like, you'd wear them if they match your high school team's colors, wouldn't you?
Yeah, no, I've got nothing to argue with that. I think this is one that I was pessimistic about there for a while, and I feel a lot better about it now. Like you said, if he were to show up in Ann Arbor for that barbecue, that obviously is probably a nail in the coffin, so to speak. But I guess I don't see any reason why that would happen. And my expectation is he picks Ohio State here in a couple weeks. But, again, stranger things have happened. So,
yeah, it's not many stranger things have happened than that. But the simple truth is Aaron Scott, I've talked to him fairly recently. He has not made a decision. He could show up at Ohio State on June 28th also. And then, people would read into that and say, oh, he's at Ohio State for their barbecue. He's definitely going to Ohio State. But then 2 days later, he could be at Michigan. And you just don't know. Obviously, it's not ideal if he's at Michigan on the day he's making his decision, considering, again, it is his father's birthday and all the other things that are going into that. My belief on this has never really changed, is that I think ultimately Ohio State wins this fight. I'm going to say still on Aaron Scott, but it is not a done deal, and Ohio State will have to fight this battle for the next few months. And some of that's going to be showing him how a true man corner like he is will be used in this defense. I think there's also a need for Ohio State to articulate the fact that if you look at the Buckeyes cornerback room, and with the belief that Denzel Burke and Jordan Hancock will both be off the roster after this coming season, one way or another. I mean, obviously you want them to both be off into the NFL, and because that means they had great seasons. But if they're not off to the NFL and didn't have great seasons going into your fourth year, maybe you transfer, because there are the guys that they're coming up. And then you have Davis and Igbinosun for one more year. The opportunity for Aaron Scott to get on the field early is pretty good at Ohio State too, if he's as good as advertised. And Michigan is selling, hey, we don't have enough players at the spot. They're loaded. But the truth is Ohio State's not really loaded at the outside cornerback position. And so you have to find some way, if you're Ohio State, to balance that conversation out.
Yeah, exactly. 2 cornerbacks committed already. Bryce West, probably more of an outside guy. Miles Lockhart, definitely more of that slot corner. People should definitely watch your Bermanology episode with him. He seems like an awesome kid. But adding Aaron Scott as that other corner on the outside, I mean, that's the ideal cornerback class. And maybe you keep shooting for a guy like Kobe Black, but landing Aaron Scott would be a possible finishing touch for the class. And I think we're both expecting that here in a couple weeks.
Yeah, still have him in, but not like a in period. This is more of a in question mark. I do think that ultimately the Buckeyes will win the fight, but until like I hear it definitively one way or another, it's hard. Michigan is doing a great job getting him, Charles Woodson in his ear all the time, drumming up this interest in the idea of being the villain and all that stuff. And, villains don't usually win in the stories. So storybooks are written the same way a hero's arc is written the same way for thousands of years, because generally that's how it goes. The bad guys generally lose. So we'll see. I'm not saying, you know what I'm saying. Come on, you guys know what I'm saying.
Yes,
you know what I'm saying. So after the decision from Aaron Scott on July 30th comes August 5th of KJ Bolden, who, boy, oh boy, this one just feels weird. Like, I believe Ohio State is leading in this recruitment. And I say that, and I mean it. But I also feel like with 3.5 weeks to go, the odds for shenanigans are pretty high. And to potentially lose that grip or lose that spot is a real concern for Ohio State. And I'm going to say this, and I know it'll end up on Georgia message boards or whatever, probably, because it's just what happens. I think Alabama is the bigger threat here than Georgia. And I don't know that means he's going to pick Alabama. I don't know. He may pick Georgia. I could see him very, very easily picking Ohio State, Alabama, or Georgia on August 5th. But I do think right now Alabama is the bigger threat to Ohio State than Georgia is, and we'll see what the Buckeyes are able to do to counter the way that Alabama plays the recruiting game versus the way that they do. And certainly from a need perspective, what Ohio State needs at safety, like this is maybe the most important defensive player left on the board from that perspective for Ohio State. Maybe. I mean, Dylan Stewart and Eddrick Houston, those guys are obviously pretty important, but this is one that I can completely understand where Ohio State fans are not feeling comfortable or confident until like February. And even if he signs in December, he needs to show up on campus in Columbus in January and then stay there for a month and then, do a change of address at the post office and, buy a welcome mat for his apartment so people know where, until all that happens, until he gets a key ring made with his address in Columbus so he doesn't get lost. Until all that happens, I can understand people be worried,
Yeah, I do. And it's interesting because most of the Georgia chatter from some of their guys who are all very good at their jobs has always been that it's going to be Georgia or Ohio State, at least from what I've seen.
Yeah.
So maybe that fact that Ohio State seems to be that constant, maybe that's a good thing. Maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe this is Kalo Downs 2.0. I don't know. You've had him in for a long time. I lean out. Obviously, I'm just the fan. I'm scarred by last cycle, but I've kind of leaned like he's out, but I flip a coin for me. 50-50, time will tell.
I don't like to be the percentage guy. You guys, anyone who's followed me for a while knows that. I spoke to a pretty dialed in source on this recruitment 2 days ago, and they said, right now, I think it's 51-49 for Ohio State. And now that 49 is a combination of the SEC, not necessarily one school or the other. It was Ohio State believes that they are in the driver's seat here. They're in a position to win this, but they have to deal with some very interesting times that we're living in. And it's not going to be a situation where Ohio State is being outgunned on the NIL front or anything like that. So if it ends up being that he stays home or stays in the South, they're just going to have to adjust and get beat. But I believe he's right now, if he had to choose, I think he'd pick Ohio State. And because of that, I'm still going to say in. Maybe that changes in 3 weeks, but I think still in for KJ Bolden. That's how I feel about it. And Gary Robinson, I'm sorry for getting your hopes up, but I don't believe that KJ Bolden is going to Georgia right now. So I'm not going to lie to myself and by proxy lie to all of you by saying that. So yeah, I'm very, I understand I could be wrong on this one, but all the intel I've gotten on KJ Bolden for months has been that Ohio State is a much, much, much more real threat in this fight than anyone's ever given them credit for. And everything that's happened in those months has bore that out. So now you got to finish. You have to finish if you're Ohio State. And that's the same thing with Eddrick Houston, Bolden's teammate at Buford High School. 17 days after KJ Bolden makes his announcement, Eddrick Houston will make his on August 22nd. Andrew, none of the crystal balls or anything have changed since they were entered for Ohio State prior to his official visit to Columbus. But again, when Alabama's involved, it feels terrifying. And now you have the NIL monster that USC is trying to become, but they're fighting a different fight there. I just don't see that. I know USC should not be dismissed in this recruitment, but this does feel to me like an Ohio State versus Ohio State versus the SEC type of fight. So have you seen anything or heard anything or read anything that makes you feel different?
No, I don't. For a while there, it seemed like it was maybe Ohio State versus Clemson. And then, now it seems like it's probably Ohio State, Alabama. I don't know. When we were talking about Aaron Scott and you said you had him in with a question mark after it, it seems kind of weird that of all the names we're talking about, this defensive lineman from Georgia is probably the guy on this list that we feel like is in with a period after it instead of a question mark. At least that's how I kind of view this. I know Alabama's always kind of lurking, but really of all the names we're talking about today, it feels very weird to consider this maybe the one that we're most optimistic about, or at least me. I don't know if that's changed for you, but
no, I mean, I still would say that I feel like Ohio State's in a really great spot here. And I think that they're the leader with a month to go. And that's the problem. There's 5 weeks left before he makes a decision. And you would like it for a player who, if they're that, and Ohio State's been the leader here for a while now. So this isn't like it happened after the official visit. So you'd hope that after having months of being in that spot, that the player wouldn't need to wait until a circled date on the calendar to say I'm in, because the value of adding Eddrick Houston now, if he decided, hey, you know what, why am I going to wait another 5 weeks? I know Ohio State's where I want to be. the value that you gain, that the Buckeyes gain by having him commit publicly, is just tremendously huge. So, like, there's this fine line the coaching staff has to walk, which is telling a kid and their families, we understand this is your process, handle it exactly how you want. We're supportive of waiting until December if you need to. And on the flip side of that, there's but if you would just make a decision now, you could probably help with KJ Bolden. You could probably help with Dylan Stewart. You and Dylan Stewart and Justin Scott could help with Kyngstonn Viliamu-Asa and Aaron Scott and Zaquan Patterson, and all of a sudden you're talking about potentially one of the best defensive classes Ohio State's ever signed. If you just have someone who's willing to take that first step and say, I don't need all of this other extracurricular stuff to happen before I make that decision. Because, again, it doesn't seem like there's been much real drama in this recruitment thus far. So why do you have to wait?
Yeah, I'm just kind of imagining how much better the fan base, myself included, would feel right now if there were 3 5-star defensive linemen committed rather than just the one that was kind of the most surprising of them all in Justin Scott. Yeah. But I don't know. My assumption is he's probably stated his intentions to the coaching staff, and they probably have a good idea of what's going to go down here in about a month or so. Obviously, if it was public, it'd be that much better. If he wants to commit on his birthday or some special day, that's fine. And I'm sure the staff is going to keep that line of communication very much open and going strong for the next month. So I feel pretty good about it. But again, Nick Saban, you never know. But I got him in pretty strong.
You just never know, and you'd much rather have it be done and over with. And so we've dealt with 6 different players who have commitment dates in the next 5 weeks. So when I'm talking about you just never know, that brings us to Jeremiah McClellan. No decision date planned. Ohio State has been the presumptive leader in this recruitment since March, when he made a visit to Ohio State in the spring, came back for his official. The Buckeyes basically passed on other wide receiver options that were interested, namely a guy like Keelan Adams down in Virginia, who is now likely going to end up at Virginia Tech, I think, because they are confident in where things are with Jeremiah McClellan. But he made an unofficial visit to Oregon at the end of April that was sort of viewed as a throwaway, like, whatever. Number one, you don't make an unofficial visit to Oregon in April, even if you're not paying for it yourself, because I'm sure Oregon has found some way around that. But then to make an official visit in June, and now there's talk about him going back there at the end of July for another unofficial visit. That's when my ears start to perk up, and I'm actually probably feeling less confident about this one than I should be based on what I've been told by people who are around the Ohio State program and where they feel. But to me, it feels like something is like there's a misfire or a disconnect happening here. And I will double down on that and remove him from the in list if he makes that visit to Oregon at the end of the month, which we'll see.
Yeah, no, I think we would both probably have him in right now as we sit here tonight. Not like in ink, but in like a colored pencil maybe or something like that. And then if he does make that trip back to Eugene, then that's concerning. I mean, Oregon's not really like known for, unless I'm misremembering, like sending a bunch of receivers to the league. And Ohio State obviously is. So that's kind of strange. But again, it's Oregon, Phil Knight, Nike, all that stuff, cool campus, cool facilities. But if he does get back there, then yes, that's a very big red flag.
What's interesting is that if we go back to like last November, Ohio State's been looking for this inside receiver in this class for a while now. They thought it was going to be Tysier Denmark from Philadelphia, who was going to commit to Ohio State on like November 25th. And then Oregon swooped in, made from what I understand, a fairly lucrative NIL offer to him that swayed his commitment at the last minute. Ohio State, knowing that Jeremiah Smith is in this class, knowing what Mylan Graham, another 5-star wide receiver in this class. And again, we go back to the first part of this conversation tonight, is that you have to consider how you allocate certain things in this world. You have 2 5-star receivers in this class and Jeremiah Smith, who's the best player in the country, being pulled at in 1,000 different directions. you are hoping that a player like Jeremiah McClellan, who is very good in his own right, and it shouldn't be dismissed, but he is not on the same level that those two guys are at this point. So you're hoping that he views things in the way that Carnell Tate or Brandon Innes or Noah Rogers or Bryson Rogers did a year ago, and say, I understand there's going to be X amount available for me in the NIL marketplace once I get on campus and once I'm there and part of the roster, and the development and the opportunity to work with Brian Hartline is worth passing up a little bit of the short-term money. That's the hope. And Oregon, who pulled the rug out on the Tysier Denmark recruitment and then summarily dismissed him from the recruiting class 3 weeks ago when he flipped to Penn State, now has this extra allocation, let's say, available that they can turn around and point in McClellan's direction. And that is something that he and his family will have to consider and observe. And that's where, again, things are so much different now than they've ever been that it becomes nearly impossible to stand by the old rules and regulations of what recruiting was. And I think it's clear that Jeremiah McClellan has a very high interest in Ohio State. But once that thing gets in your ear and you start to believe other stuff, then it becomes a matter of making a tough personal decision. And he'll have to do that. And, Ohio State obviously didn't get the commitment of Elijah Moore a week ago when he committed to Florida State over Ohio State. We talked about that on the most recent Talking Stuff before this, and that Ohio State was not going to go crazy or miss too much if they didn't get Elijah Moore. In some ways, he was a backup plan in the event that Jeremiah Smith's recruitment derailed or went off in a funky way. And now that has solidified and seemed to calm down, then it's like we maybe don't need this. So Jeremiah Smith, Mile and Graham are great, and you need and want that third piece. And they want Jeremiah McClellan to be that third piece. But saying if he goes back out to Oregon on another unofficial visit that he's certainly that his family's certainly not paying for themselves, I'd be shocked if they are, because that's just not the way it works anymore. That would be pretty telling about his decision. And he's saying he could make a decision at any time between now and his senior season beginning.
Yeah, and I hope when people hear us talking about the NIL stuff that we're not like blaming NIL for every lost recruitment or anything like that, because like we've said over and over again, Ohio State's NIL situation today is so much different and better than it was last year. You keep using the word allocation and that kind of thing, and that's kind of what this is all about. It's not just Ohio State's NIL is a mess still today. It's just, they've got 2 5-star wide receivers in the fold already. Oregon doesn't. So
it becomes it's a priority thing, but it also becomes relying on the relationship and hoping that player understands the long-term intrinsic value of being a wide receiver at Ohio State and is able to look past what is being clearly a more lucrative initial NIL opportunity somewhere else. That's the hard part. And that's NIL is going to be a part of every one of these conversations. And it's not the whole conversation anymore, but it is the final conversation in a lot of these relationships and a lot of these recruitments. And that's where we're at in the recruitment of Brandon Baker, I think, between Ohio State, Oregon, and Texas, who I think they are the top 3. And then you're going to have USC, Georgia, Florida State, Nebraska, et cetera. To me, this is an Ohio State, Oregon, and Texas battle. I said on the last episode I have him in. I think he would commit. I think given the chance or the choice of or the requirement of committing today, I think it'd be Ohio State. But Oregon, again, is expecting to see him once more before he makes a decision. Not in an official capacity. He said he's not taking an official visit there. But like Ohio State feels really good about where things are with Brandon Baker, but so does Texas, so does Oregon. And now it becomes this like 3-pronged approach. There's the NIL, there's the football, there's the coaching, and how does it all work together? I still have Brandon Baker in as far as Ohio State goes, but I know that is a challenge upcoming.
Yeah, the pessimist in me is going to come out again with this one. Like, I don't know. I just, that Oregon, multiple trips to Oregon, another possible return trip to Oregon, that just has me, that makes it tough to be optimistic about this one. I do think Justin Frye's done a hell of a job, and I wouldn't be like floored if this did end up working out in Ohio State's favor. I mean, but my personal opinion is that they're going to have to end up finding another piece to the offensive line during the fall or sometime leading up to November. But I would absolutely love to be wrong about that.
Yeah, and he's another guy that could commit, he said, anytime before his senior season. He's also a guy that has said he could wait until November. So I have him on this list of 10 players because I do believe that he is most likely to commit before his season begins. Ohio State would just love to get him back on campus again one way or another. If he commits somewhere else and they can still get him out in October for the Penn State game or something like that, a night game in Ohio Stadium, somewhere, maybe the November 11th game against Michigan State, whatever. They want to make sure that his visit history in Columbus doesn't work against them. He's been there twice, but the first visit was for like 4 hours, and the second visit was a eye-opening, game-changing, recruitment-altering visit for his official visit on June 9th. So, like, you need to get him back on campus again. This is a situation where, like, Ohio State, you wish that they would break the rules because you'd rather have them just fly someone out and find a way to pay for their unofficial visit like most other schools seem to be doing right now. But they aren't, and they're not going to do that, and that is the way it is. So what you're hoping for, I guess, is that these young people who are 6 months away from having six figures in their bank accounts will be able to, tell mom and dad, put it on the credit card and we'll pay it back in 6 months, and let's just fly out there for another visit. So that's where things are there. I don't think that you're going to see any like real sudden shifts of momentum here because Brandon is not someone that talks about this a lot. There are a few people that are really dialed in with his recruitment on the West Coast. Those people are still saying that it might be Ohio State in the lead. So that's where I'm leaning, and I know the Buckeyes feel pretty good about where they are with him. If they don't get Brandon Baker, the other real offensive line option still is Gerby Lambert from Massachusetts. Ohio State, Notre Dame, Boston College, and Harvard are his final four schools. He's going to decide in the next month. He actually admitted in an interview with 247 Sports' Brian Doan on Tuesday that Notre Dame probably has a slight edge in his recruitment, and I think that's expected. This kid does not do any interviews unless you're talking to him in person. He is not a kid that is he doesn't tweet. He doesn't do anything like about any of this stuff. I wrote on Tuesday that I think that there's this assumption that he's looking for a smaller campus and a little bit more personal feel on campus. And that's why I think Notre Dame is the best combination of everything he's looking for. And I think he will end up at Notre Dame. So I have him out, but I do think Ohio State is still in this battle, and the relationship Justin Frye has with his high school coach is very good, and the Buckeyes are just hoping that can keep some things opening up here.
Yeah, I don't have much to add on that one. I've got him a stronger out than I do Spillman, even, I would say. So not a lot to add on that one.
Yeah, and it's not like a situation where, again, this isn't where I feel like Ohio State is losing something. I just think, like, you recruit players and people that fit your program, and sometimes those players and people that fit your program are looking for something that's a little bit more personal for them. He goes to a Catholic school. He's very reclusive and private, and I think he is probably just looking for a smaller place to play football. Not that Notre Dame is small football, but the campus is very different than Ohio State's is. So probably Notre Dame for him. And that leads us to our final of 10 players that we're talking about today, and that's Dylan Stewart. 5-star defensive end. Most people have him as the number 2 ranked defensive end in the country now, behind Williams and Winari from St. Louis. This feels like a 2-team fight, Ohio State and South Carolina, and that is weird to say because normally you would say Ohio State and South Carolina, okay, he's going to Ohio State, but South Carolina signed Nicholas Harbor from the DMV last year. Very similar player, very similar recruitment, where it came down to the end and it was Michigan or Oregon or South Carolina. And then, he commits to South Carolina. And Michigan and Oregon are like, what the hell happened here? How'd that occur? I think that Ohio State is going to win the Dylan Stewart battle, but this is one where what he does at the end of this month to me is going to be very, very telling. He's going to have an option to go to Ohio State or South Carolina on July 28th, or he could go no place. And if he decides to go to South Carolina, I can't see any way that's a good thing for Ohio State, especially considering that the expectation with Dylan Stewart is that a decision gets made like the first week of August. So if he goes to South Carolina on the 30th and makes a decision a week later, then I don't feel real good about that.
Yeah, and the problem with that is right now, and we're still a few weeks away, but right now the expectation from the South Carolina side seems to be that he will be back there the final weekend of the month. That's concerning, I think. Now, maybe Ohio State is under the impression that he's not going to make that trip, or he will make that trip and it's not going to matter in the long term. I don't know. I would say like 3 weeks ago, I personally felt like or 2 weeks ago, felt a little bit better about this one than I do right now. But I don't know.
It's another one of those fights where you're like, man, if you know where you're going, can you just say it and help us build a class and help, kickstart some momentum for a really great defensive run of recruits? And, this is the final conversation. This one's going to come down to NIL pretty much at the baseline of it. Ohio State needs defensive ends badly. Larry Johnson's reputation in the Washington, D.C. area is unrivaled. They clearly have an opening there with Jack Sawyer and JT Tuimoloau potentially both gone from the roster after this year. Like, there's no universe that exists where 2 years ago, if Dylan Stewart was thinking about Ohio State or South Carolina, he was picking Ohio State 100% of the time. South Carolina is very aggressive with NIL. Ohio State is being very aggressive in this recruitment without question. And I say that knowing wholeheartedly that people will think that they're not going as hard as other. That's just not true. They are, but there are still gray areas in recruiting, even with NIL. And the Buckeyes are not going to play in some of those. And so you hope that everything you've done to this point is enough to get it done. I still have Dylan Stewart in, and I think that's where he's going to end up at Ohio State. But we'll see, because like I said, that end of the month is pretty important.
Yeah, I've got him in too, but not as firmly in as I would like to be right now.
Yeah. So overall, Jaden Jackson out, Edwin Spillman out, Kyngstonn Viliamu-Asa in, Aaron Scott in, KJ Bolden in, Eddrick Houston in, Jeremiah McClellan in, Brandon Baker in, Kirby Lambert out, and Dylan Stewart in. Like, if that happened, that's pretty damn good. And I don't think anyone's going to complain about where Ohio State's doing on the recruiting trail. But that is going to be a next 5 weeks in the recruiting world that is going to shape not just the rest of the 2024 class for Ohio State, but I think it's going to really psychologically impact a lot of people if Ohio State doesn't finish this out strong because of how last season went. So, Andrew, let's take a few questions. I don't know if you're watching the stream here or not, but
I'm not. But there was one from the board that I was going to bring up to you just because it was a good question that one of our regulars posited the other day.
What do you think?
So Mr. Brightside, a regular poster, just brought up, like, again, we've talked about it before. They're kind of fishing out of some smaller ponds here. Like with, defensive end, they want probably 3 guys. I mean, hell, they could maybe take 4. And there's 3?
In my opinion.
Yeah, they should. And there's like 3 realistic names that we've talked about today. And Eddrick Houston might even be more of a Cam Hayward, Adolphus Washington, Draymond Jones type. But just the question that was asked is, like, what are they going to do if things go haywire? And I don't want to say like they miss on every single guy, because that's not going to happen, but just like, where are they going to go? And a lot of people keep saying it's only July, and that's true. It is only July, but the recruiting calendar is so much different now than it was. It seems to move up every single year. These kids want to get their decisions done before their season start a lot of the time, and obviously before December. So I don't know. Like, he's just kind of wondering what's going to happen if they do like strike out on a lot of these guys, and I have no earthly idea.
I don't have names that I'm going to sit here and reveal or say, because quite frankly, the Ohio State staff is confident in the players they're chasing, and they're not. And again, because everything is so different now, like the NIL world, they have a handful of guys at the top of this list that they are going after in a way they've not recruited anyone in the last 2 years. I can tell you that without a doubt. So if those players still miss, then it's not like you're going to turn around and offer Joe Schmo the same opportunity you're offering Dylan Stewart. Okay. And Joe Schmo may be a good player, but you're not. So everything has to be reevaluated at that point. And you then have to go back to the evaluations that you made throughout the winter and throughout the spring. And then you get junior or, senior tape on people. Then you have the transfer portal. Like, there's a lot of things that are still in place here. But I don't think Ohio State is thinking what happens if we miss on these guys, because it's Ohio State and they don't believe they're going to miss on these guys. And I've said this the last two shows. If you have a belief that you're not recruiting players, or you're not capable of landing the players you're recruiting, you're not going to land the players you're recruiting. And you're going to, that sort of attitude, that sort of approach is going to lead to losses. They're confident in these guys. If they have to adjust, they will. We've talked before about Charleston Collins. Dominic Kirks, who committed to Washington from Cleveland, is a player I really like. I think you could see them make a move there. Obviously, the name Brian Robinson's been brought up a number of times in the past. Like, there are defensive ends around the country that are good players, but these players are not. It's not we missed on Dylan Stewart, let's immediately plug in this guy in this hole. That player doesn't exist. There's a reason Dylan Stewart's a 5-star and the number 2 ranked defensive end in the country, because he's that player. Now, a player like Marquise Lightfoot, for example, could certainly be more in play at that point, because, as we already talked about with allocating resources, now you have a little bit more to play with than you were initially considering for that role. So he could be a guy that you see him go back to. But I just don't think that the Buckeyes are even looking beyond that top of the board, because there's no point. Because if you want to put all your energy into landing these guys right now. So we'll see. We'll see.
It does seem like the level of confidence from the coaching staff, you would know better than I do, but it seems like the level of confidence right now with guys like Stewart and obviously Houston, like, it seems like the level of confidence is higher than it was for Damon Wilson, Keon Keeley, and Mateo last cycle. So at least that's my opinion. It seems that way, which is a positive. But
yeah, because they know that they have the NIL thing figured out. Now, again, that doesn't mean you're going to win all of these fights, but it does mean that you're going into it with both hands free and understanding that you're going to be able to swing punch for punch with everyone around the country, as opposed to last year where you were trying to fight with one arm behind your back. And that's just not how you win. So let's see. Keith 7456 on threes. Matt Parker. Hi, Matt. On Jaden Jackson. Talked with some sources today who knows Texas, Miami, Oklahoma well, and have all said the same thing. Feels like Ohio State, but not certain. I'm actually the exact opposite of that from everyone I've talked to. It feels like any one of those schools and not Ohio State. So I guess we will see how that plays out on Thursday. What else? Andrew, any other questions that you got, or?
Not really. We've talked all about 24. I don't think there's really a ton of movement with anybody in 2025 right now. Not that I can think of, really. I mean,
no, it's been relatively calm, and that's, we will see a lot of these kids get back on campus on June 20 or July 28th. And if you're looking for a barometer to gauge like who's the real deal, top of the line of importance for Ohio State in 2025, that July 28th date for those rising juniors, you'll see who shows up, and that's going to be pretty important. But it's not something where you're like looking at 25 class and going, oh, we got to get moving. You've got your quarterback. You still got Jonte Gilbert in the fold. That's always a fun one to speculate on. But he hasn't decommitted, and he still talks to Ohio State all the time, still planning on coming back for more, for games this year. Like, Jonte is a really open kid about his process and how he feels about things. And he says, I love Ohio State. I don't want to decommit. I want to go to Ohio State. So we'll see. There's a long way to go there, but you have 2 really good players committed, and you hope that you can use them to build around.
Do we know, is Ohio State doing anything that weekend for like the 2024 guys? And you may have answered this question on the board. Obviously, Michigan's doing their barbecue and all that stuff, and maybe all of that's more aimed toward 2025. But I didn't know what Ohio State has lined up exactly.
I mean, from what I understand, they're going to have some sort of get together, like a games and cookout and that sort of stuff, very similar to what most schools around the country are doing. It's not going to be a competitive camp or something like that. You don't want to have kids coming to campus and working out a week before they start their high school football seasons and hurt themselves or anything like that. So it's really just designed to get the commits back together again, as many as they can, and to get as many of the best players from around the Midwest that'll into town as possible. What is interesting is that their date is on the 28th. Michigan's is on the 30th. So there's a very real possibility that a lot of these kids who are from the 2025 class, 2026, et cetera, can probably hit up both spots, which, I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. I think it's great for the recruits, but I think that the teams would rather have it so that you kind of had to pick one or the other, but that's the way it's going now. I think that's all. I'm good.
Yeah, it's just kind of quiet right now. Like, no, I mean, it's not quiet. We're just kind of in the waiting period. Like, there's obviously not, visits happening and stuff. It's just kind of wait for these announcements to transpire. So that's where we're at.
Tyler Carrisley, is NIL going to be like the salary cap in the NFL? In some ways, I think it is being viewed similarly by these programs, but not really. It's like, because not everyone has the same amount to play with. The school is not going to pay it. Not everyone gets a contract. It's going to be different. There are going to be some guys that are going to have to get on campus and do it the old fashioned way and make deals with their local, their hometown car dealerships and that kind of stuff. And then there's other ones that Ohio State is going to be a little bit more aggressive in making sure that they have things set up and ready for them when they get to campus. But Ohio State is not in the business of handing things out up front or before a player is going to be on campus. So that is still one of the major differences between how they're operating and how others are. So that's something you have to deal with. Andrew, I got nothing else. We're closing in an hour, and should be a good month for Ohio State, but it could also be a terrible one. So my advice to everyone, just take a deep breath and get ready, because the next 5 weeks is going to make or break the 2024 class for Ohio State as far as where it ends up nationally. Right now, it's the number 2 ranked class in the country, according to Rivals.com. Per player ranking, Ohio State is the best in the country by a fairly significant margin, even over Georgia, who has 26 commitments right now. Ohio State with 18. Again, it's like apples to oranges right now. I don't even know how to explain how these schools are doing what they're doing, because it makes no sense. Georgia is certainly capitalizing on being a back-to-back national champion for sure. So
one last thing. What's our final number we're expecting for 2024? Do we have a number in mind?
Well, they're at 18 right now. If they get everyone, I said tonight, that's like 7 of these guys, right? So that'd take you to 25. I could see 26 to 27 probably. If things go the way that they could in the next 5 weeks, you could be done with this class and then saving whatever extra spots you have for the portal and getting more developed players, guys that are a little bit more college ready. And I won't be surprised if that's the approach Ohio State takes, because there is some momentum in the program right now for guys like Josh Simmons, Tywan Malone, Davis Igbinosun, Jihad Carter, realizing it might make more sense to bring in a dude that's played a couple years of college football, because they are not going to be as easily guided or misguided in the process as a high school kid is, who's dealing with his third uncle or something like that, as Urban Meyer would say. So that's it. Andrew Ellis, Jeremy Birmingham. This has been Talking Stuff on the podcast. Please rate, review, subscribe. If you're watching the stream, hit like and give a little support. Those things actually go a long way towards helping us in the algorithm and all the other stuff. If you're on iTunes or whatever, please leave a review, a 5-star review if you can, because that's the best thing. Subscribe to the channel. If you're watching this and you're not subscribed to our YouTube channel, that's not very fair or very nice. I don't even care if you hate subscribe us. If you're a Georgia fan who came here to be mad at me about saying KJ Bolden is more likely to go to Alabama than Georgia, that's fine. You should still subscribe to the channel. And then that way you can troll me when he picks Georgia. Cool? I mean, it seems good. Seems good. I'm out of here. Andrew's out of here. That's the end of the show. Goodbye.